As we turn to the Holy Scriptures, may they speak to us today as they have spoken to so many, so that God's loving kindness may inspire us and God's eternal wisdom shape us. Amen. Our reading for today, before I go really off topic into left field, it's okay. It relates. It's important. But our reading for today is Genesis 21, chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. This is shortly after the birth of Isaac, the son of Abraham. At this point, it should be noted that Ishmael, Abraham's older son with Hagar, is about 13 or so. And now he has a son with Sarah. And so there's some conflict. So I will read. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. And for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look upon the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. I have a great sermon on that I've done in the past, and I was really tempted to just kind of drag it forward. But this reading brings up a really interesting issue. Issue's maybe the wrong word. A really interesting topic that I thought would be fun to address because of some of the things that I have heard from people between services. People seem to like how deep I dig into the text and the original things, and we're going to take a real deep dive into the actual text of Scripture rather than the narrative of this particular story. Here's why. Okay, so we're going to look at 21:9. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. Okay? That's not all that exciting. But now we're going to quick flash over. I have here a King James translation. Good old King Jimmy. And according to Jimmy, in 21:9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. The end. Not mocking Isaac. Isaac is not named. Not playing, mocking. And if you dig up other translations in English, which you can find a bunch, there's playing with Isaac, there's mocking Isaac, there's sporting with Isaac, there's insulting, there's plus or minus Isaac, right? He could be laughing, sees Ishmael laughing, sees Ishmael joking. You can find all of them in English translations. And with or without Isaac. And it's an interesting question of a word choice, because that makes a difference, doesn't it, when you're reading the story? Word choice there matters. If Ishmael is just having fun, playing, or even playing nicely with Isaac, then Sarah's anger at this seems a little misplaced. We might be a little harsher on that. But if Ishmael is sitting there beating Isaac up or something, well, now you understand her desire more to defend her son from this other kid. Part of that is a question of word choice, but part of it is also an issue of manuscript. Because when you're making translations from a text, because believe it or not, this wasn't all written in English first. I know, that's hard to imagine, but when it was written, there are a bunch of copies of this text, and some of them include Isaac, and some of them don't. And so, something that I think is worth addressing is, how do we get from a bunch of ancient people taking scrolls or parchment or whatever they happen to have and scribbling a bunch of words on it and rolling that up, to having a nice bound text like this in our very own language that we can stick in every pew? We got dozens of them out there, right? So that together when we gather on Sunday, we can all read it in our own language, and they all have the same words, and it's all compiled nicely. Like, there's a big gap between that. So I want to talk today about how we get to here, because I think that informs a lot about how we read this and what we do with this. The Bible is a pretty important text. We go to it every Sunday, and if we're going to interact with it that much, I just wanted to take some time to get to where we are. So when I read the New Testament in particular, I like using something like this. This is the New Testament in Greek. All right? The New Testament was originally written in Greek. I am not an expert in the Greek language, but I can get by, and I have lots of dictionaries and resources and programs that help me out. But the other thing I like about this particular version of the New Testament in Greek, and I'm going to have to walk down and show everybody quick, is there's a lot of footnotes. Okay? So if you see the text at the top, and then all the tiny footnotes, see like half the page on all these is just footnotes? Okay? Like, and I can flip through this, but almost half the page here is just these little tiny footnotes. And what all of those footnotes show, people are used to footnotes on a lot of like study Bibles and whatnot, right? So in here, there's a lot of footnotes too. These are explaining things in the text above, right? They say where references are, or when this is talking about a known ancient story or something. These footnotes are showing me where in this text different manuscripts read different or include different words. So nowadays we have printing presses and everything comes out the same. But if you have to copy it all by hand hundreds of times, a whole bunch of different people, and hand that off to someone else, and these are not scrolls being put in temperature-controlled libraries in some kind of vault, right? So they start wearing away. So then the next generation has to hand copy all that, and the next generation has to hand copy all that. You start getting some grammar and spelling issues. You start getting some random inclusions. So I'm going to start from the beginning. I have a whole bunch of notes. I'm just going to do it because I can do it. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, we get the first mention of this people group that later on comes to be known as Israel, Judah, now the Jews. Somewhere around 1200, this particular group of people is separated off, as far as we can tell, from the rest of the cultures around them. And they start writing stuff. The oldest chunks of this book, as far as we can tell, come from probably shortly after that. In the book of Judges, we get stuff that isn't written in the right structure for Hebrew. I don't know if you've ever read anything that's like a quick translation. If you go into Google Translate and type it in, you can get some funny stuff. But word order kind of matters in a certain way, right? And so some of the oldest stuff in here is written in a format that matches another language called Ugaritic. And Ugaritic dies out around 1177. So that means that the earliest writings that we have here are probably somewhere around then. So people are having these experiences, collecting these stories, putting it all onto paper. And somewhere between, your 1200-ish and the Assyrian conquest of Samaria, which we've talked about a bunch of times, right? When they come in and destroy the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom, a whole bunch of books are written. That's where we get our chunks of Genesis and Exodus. We get stories from 1st and 2nd Samuel. We get some of the prophets. All of this stuff is written on individual scrolls. And you have a bunch of that in the temple in Jerusalem. There was a whole bunch of it up north in the city of Samaria. There's a whole bunch of it spread around, right, that Levites and various priests, and some of them have little stashes, right, of particularly important scrolls to them. There's all these scrolls. And over time, especially after Assyria destroys the north, all of these scrolls that are being independently hand-copied, right, as the parchment, as the thing they're written on starts falling apart, or if they just want more copies of them, are getting hand-copied, and eventually all these scrolls and documents and whatnot make their way to the temple in Jerusalem, most likely. Everything that exists was probably more or less concentrated there when Babylon took the city and destroyed it. And then we go back to Jeremiah, right? We talked about that a lot last fall. The destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, and all of the people of any importance were dragged off to Babylon, bringing with them, largely, all their documentation. That was treasure to a certain extent for the Babylonians. I mean, remember, writing is valuable. In the ancient world, when a fraction of a percentage of people can read or write, books are treasure. Scrolls are valuable. And the cases that they're in themselves may have had gold or silver linings on them. So that gets dragged with all of the priests and the scholars from the temple to Babylon. And the vast majority of the Old Testament, as we see it in here, was probably edited together and kind of finalized more or less into the form we have it while they're in Babylon. Probably. Persia comes in, destroys Babylon, they go back. Now, to be clear, the entire Hebrew language, written language, the alphabet, the shape of the letters and everything changes in Babylon. Because prior to that, they're using Phoenician script, and after that, they're using Babylonian influenced script. So now they have a different written form of their language, and they come back and they start writing some more stuff, right? We have Ezra and Nehemiah. We have some of the late chunks of Isaiah. They write a bunch more stuff. And then there's this guy called Alexander the Great. Some of you may have heard of him. I don't think he was that great personally, but clearly I'm in the minority opinion on that one. He's this Macedonian guy. Sorry, he would call himself Greek. There's this Greek guy who ends up coming through and conquering the known world as far as his people are concerned. And then a little bit. He makes it all the way over into India before finally his people are like, can we please go home? Yeah, I guess. He almost died in battle, so he's like, I suppose we can go. So they come back, and now all of these territories, right, that under the Persians were largely speaking Aramaic or various local languages, end up largely speaking Greek. Greek becomes the language from Greece to Egypt. I'm going the wrong way. From Greece to Egypt, through what we now would call Iraq and Iran, all the way over to India. That whole area is now largely speaking Greek for for cultural level, your political language, your academic language. The everyday people in their towns mostly probably aren't speaking Greek, but the bulk of these people are speaking Greek. So now you have all these scrolls. They're still scrolls. They're still not compiled together into anything. In Hebrew, they've added a bunch more. There's a bunch of other writings that we don't have in here, and I'll get to that. There's a bunch of other stuff, because they haven't set a canon. There's no official list of anything. They just have collections of scrolls. Your official scriptures are whatever scrolls you happen to have available to you. And there's this city called Alexandria in northern Egypt, maybe named after this guy named Alexander when he conquered it. But Alexandria becomes a very academic town. There's this whole library that gets built there. I'm still bummed about that place burning. But in Alexandria, a bunch of Hebrew scholars of some stripe, maybe they were priestly, it's a little bit unclear who exactly is doing this, but in Alexandria, most likely, people go through and they take the scriptures in Hebrew. Remember, there's Jews now, people from Judea, all over this Mediterranean world. They take their scriptures and they translate them from Hebrew into Greek. Not all at once. You get chunks of it, like the first 5 books first, and then over time, you get all of these texts translated into Greek. And this text we call the Septuagint. The Septuagint ends up becoming the most popular version of these texts because everybody is speaking Greek. If you are Judean, but you live in Greece, or you live in Rome, Italy, or you live in what is now Iraq, Greek is the language of choice for a lot of people. And so the Septuagint becomes kind of the dominant version of these scriptures for a lot of common people. Then Rome comes. So we get a couple hundred years, we get some time, complicated stuff happens. We get into the 1st century, all right? Now we're in Jesus territory, okay? The Septuagint may have been compiled into book-ish codices. This, by the way, is technically called a codex, but may have been compiled into codices, sort of like this. We don't have any if they were. But in the 1st century, you get this guy named Jesus, and his followers are big fans of this of the Hebrew scriptures in Greek. Every single time the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it quotes it from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew. And what's fun is, in the first few centuries, there's arguments over which version is better, the Greek or the Hebrew. Because a lot of early Christians liked the Greek better because the Greek translation of the text really emphasized the awaited Messiah. Like when we talk about word choice, like with Ishmael, there's word choice. Translation's never one-to-one. And the word choice for the Septuagint, for these people under the thumb of the Greeks at that time, the Septuagint really emphasizes waiting for a Messiah. In fact, it arranges the books in a way that we still use, where you end, right, with Malachi and this vision for the coming day of the Lord. If you look at a Hebrew scriptures, if you look at the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, but basically a Jewish Bible, they don't end with the prophets. They end with not 1st and 2nd Kings, Chronicles. This list of the history of their kingdom and the hope of the continuation of their nation. It is not explicitly this kind of messianic setup. And so there's arguments early on in the 1st and 2nd and into the 3rd centuries where Christians are accusing Jews of changing the Hebrew texts to cut out all the stuff about a coming Messiah. Which is funny to me. But like there's just this wacky arguments going on between people because there's no set canon and there's different manuscripts. And in 70, the temple is destroyed, thereabout, right? And so without this centralized version of things, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, the term we use now, get together and over time build a canon. They build a specific list, right? Because up to this time, stuff is still being written through this period. And so finally they're like, with the nation and the temple destroyed, we get a set list. And if you look at a Jewish Bible today, it will roughly match what we call the Old Testament, except that it's in a different order. Okay. Now there's this group called Christianity. Yay, us. And we have all of these texts from the Septuagint, and there's arguments about, well, do we like the Septuagint better, or do we like the Hebrew better? And over time, we too have to select a canon. We have to set a list. Because when Paul wrote his letters, he wasn't writing a book and sticking it with a bunch of other books, right? It wasn't attached in any way. He just wrote a letter to a congregation somewhere. And that congregation is like, man, Paul says some really good stuff. We should make a copy of this and send it to our buddies down the street in the next congregation. So they hand copy that and send it over there. And those people are like, whoa, this is good. I can see why they sent it to us. Let's make a copy of it too. So they make copies. We have found so far today about 5,000 manuscripts of all of these different books that have survived, right? There are lots of handwritten copies of all these things. But when you get into the Middle Ages, technically, there was no canon set for the New Testament. There's a lot of arguments about it. You can go back and read in the 200s and the 300s, all these early church leaders arguing about what should and shouldn't be included. Why do we need 4 Gospels? Can we push them together into one? You know, what about this letter? Does this belong or not? Officially, no canon was set. They just sort of took the Septuagint and they took the letters that, I don't know, people seem to use the most, that people seem to agree upon, and they translated them all into Latin, and this is where we get the Vulgate. And the Vulgate became the standard Bible for Christianity once it became legalized after the Edict of Milan in 313. So now they had a list of books. They had an Old Testament and a New Testament, and they weren't writing more. They had more or less a list in Latin. And they said, you know what? I think, by the way, the Vulgate Old Testament is the Septuagint translated into Latin, not the Hebrew. So it is the Hebrew translated into Greek and then translated into Latin. Okay? So now we have the Septuagint, and the church more or less forbids translating the Septuagint, or the Vulgate, as a whole into local languages, right? We need some kind of unity. We need some kind of uniformity, right? So we all need to use the same Bible written in the same language. And locally, all kinds of clergy are taking it and reading it and finding ways to translate it as they talk to people into local languages. But that isn't the Bible. The Bible is the Vulgate, functionally. They're just making notes and trying to work with it with people. Early on, this seemed to work fine. You get some weird manuscript changes. In fact, if you read through this, I think those are NRSV, right? The ones in the pews are NRSV. Oh, I can't speak. If you look at modern versions like the NRSV, which is what I use and is preferred in most scholarly circles right now, you'll notice there's a bunch of places where there's verses missing. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but it'll skip from 21 to 23. or it'll skip from 7 to 9. Because throughout this period, as they're hand copying manuscripts, either making copies of Greek that they largely can't read, or copies of Latin, stuff gets written in the margins a lot, which is, right? They make a little note over here like, hey, this sounds like this other book. They make footnotes like we find in our footnoted Bibles, right? Hey, also see this story in Matthew, because it's really similar. And then in the same line of copies, like down the line, instead of, hey, refer to this verse, that verse is added in underneath that. And so eventually we had to go through, and this is part of the modern thing, and weed out, well, this early version of the manuscript doesn't have it, but this one does. So somewhere in between it got added in or transposed. There's a section in John that shows up first in Luke, and then it disappears from Luke and is in Matthew, and then it disappears from Matthew and it's in John, and then it just sits in John, and we now keep it in John. Why? Because people are hand copying stuff with notes in the margins on how to do stuff, and eventually it adds up. So now we have it in Latin. How many here speak Latin? Not me. So, how do we get it in English? Well, at the beginning of what we now call the Renaissance, there's this guy named Wycliffe, or Wycliffe, if you, technically incorrect, but that's how most people say his name. Wycliffe was very upset about the inability to have the Bible in English. He was an English scholar, and so he took and started translating the Bible into English, along with writing a whole bunch of really inflammatory letters about the evils of the church and the Pope and the monasteries and things and all the terrible things they're doing. He starts translating it into English. And he is, after his death, declared a heretic, and most of the copies of the Wycliffe Bible are destroyed. We still have a few around. Once again, he's translating from the Vulgate into English. So now we're going Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English. All right. A little while after that, you get this other guy named Erasmus. He is a Catholic priest, and he says, you know what we need, you know what would be really helpful, is to have an actual Greek manuscript again for the New Testament. Because these are not floating around Europe. Remember, they've been using the Latin for 1,000 years now. So people don't even have the Greek to go back to. So he goes to his library in Switzerland, and they have 6 manuscripts. 2 of them are most of the New Testament, and he fills in the gaps with the other 4. And in places where he doesn't have a manuscript that covers it, he translates backwards from Latin into Greek, because, that's always a good idea. So then he publishes a Greek-Latin side-by-side Bible that now has the complete Latin. And people go to town on this. This is what Martin Luther uses to translate the New Testament into German. This makes it into England, and you get this guy named Tyndale, who's like, haha, and he takes it and starts making an English translation. As a random note in this, in 1511, so this is before Tyndale finishes his stuff, a printer in Paris is about to make a printing edition of the Bible and says, what would be really helpful is if we broke this up into little chunks that would make for easier reference. And he adds, a printer, not a theologian, not a scholar, a print guy, adds chapter and verse numbers. That is the first time you get consistent chapter and verse numbers in Bibles. Before 1511, I can't even, it's weird to think of the fact that for almost its entire history, the Bible didn't have chapter. Anyways, they had chapter and verse numbers. Tyndale gets one of these Greek Bibles and starts translating it. And this ends up into what becomes known as the Geneva Bible, or the Bishop's Bible. This is the first translation into English. He is declared a heretic and burned at the stake, because how dare he. But his Bibles end up surviving. And a little while later, there's an argument in England between different religious groups, because now we're past the Reformation, right? And so everyone's screaming at each other about how they're wrong, about what the Bible says. And a compromise that the different groups in England come to is we need a translation of the Bible in English that we can all get behind, that we can all use. Uniformity. We had a Vulgate for that. Anyways, so King James decides to finance this project, making a comprehensive English Bible. So of course he goes back to the Greek manuscripts and stuff. No, he takes the Geneva Bible, makes a bunch of copies and hands them to scholars, and they make notes about words that they want to change, and then they collect all of those together and edit it with all the notes. And you get the revision that becomes known as the King James Bible. Yay! The first edition of the King James Bible, by the way, because 100 years later, some other guy, one guy, takes a King James Bible. Oh, by the way, King James Bible, when it first came out, nobody liked it because the language sounded too old. It sounded archaic. People don't talk like that anymore. When it first came out, so when you read it and you're like, wow, this is so weird, it sounds so different. Yeah, in 1611 when it came out, people felt that way. Anyways, this one guy takes the King James, makes a bunch of notes, they edit that in, and you get the 1759 edition. And now, if you have a King James Bible, you have probably the 1759 edition. Okay. All this is based off of 6 Greek manuscripts in Switzerland, right? That's all Erasmus had. We now have 5,000. So over the years, as more and more were found and whatnot, they start seeing differences between all these manuscripts. This is included in this one. It's not included in this one. This uses a different word here. This thing has stuff in different orders. And so there's a huge push in the 1800s and the early 1900s to go through these manuscripts, and still today, and try to edit together, which is why we have stuff like this, where it lists out the specific manuscript and what it says instead of what the text has, because there's so many differences between them. Also, in 1804, I don't want to lie to you about the date. 1804. Everybody might be familiar with a chunk called the Apocrypha, right? Or the Deuterocanon. There's this list of books that the Roman Catholic Church still uses, but most Protestant churches don't use. It's not in the ones in the pews, okay? When the King James Bible was written, put together, that was still in it. In fact, the Apocrypha was included in English translations of the Bibles until 1804. In 1804, a printing company was like, it's really expensive. Could we cut costs anywhere? Let's just not put in this chunk, the Apocrypha. It's not as important anyways. And they just stopped publishing the Apocrypha because it made it cheaper to produce Bibles. Which is why, still today, most English translations of the Bibles, except Roman Catholic ones, don't include the Apocrypha. So, we now go to 5,000 manuscripts. We find them all over the world. And there's lots of little differences. There's some big ones. The book of Jeremiah, in the Hebrew text, in the Leningrad Codex, which is what is used for the majority of our Old Testament, is 1/6 longer than the version of Jeremiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls or from the early Septuagint. 1/6 of the book. That's not a minor difference, right? There's the whole last chapter of Mark in later manuscripts that doesn't exist in older ones. There are significant differences between some of these manuscripts, and it is fascinating to try and figure out and piece together what did it look like when it was written? What did early Christians read? What did they have? So, if you go to a bookstore and you try to find a Bible, there's a reason there's a shelf with 80 different translations and versions and whatnot, because you have to choose manuscripts. You have to choose your operating paradigm. You have to choose how you want to include footnotes. There's so many variations to account for, you can make them lots and lots and lots of different ways. So, all right, I know I've been talking a long time. This is important stuff. Why do I bother bringing all this to your attention? Because I imagine all of us could have lived long, happy lives not knowing what a giant mess this is. The Bible isn't what we want it to be. It is not just, it did not fall out of heaven written by God in our laps for us to read in our language. I do not oppose in any way. I don't argue. It says that it is inspired by God, and I'm sure it is, but Jesus also refers to Scripture as testimony. And I'm, as a fan of Jesus, going to say that that is probably the best paradigm to use. This book is testimony. It is people reflecting on their experiences of the divine, their experiences of God, their experiences of what they believe God means and intends and desires. And it is collected, written, and then collected and handed to us to be part of the conversation. Because that's what it is. This isn't, as much as we might want, a step-by-step guide to everything with precision. This is not that kind of precise. This is messy like a person. Like us. We can find all kinds of different variations of the texts that are in here, and whenever we're talking about trying to put them into play, we have to look at this as stories, as general trends. Because if you try to say this one word means this, I can find you a version that doesn't even have that word in it. This needs to be loved like a person is loved. Because we're all full of complications and complexities and disagreements and arguments. We are full of all kinds of weirdness. And if we're going to love this text and work with it, which I do very much, which is why I do this and enjoy it so much, we can be frustrated with it. We cannot pretend that it's something that it's not. We have to be honest about what it is that we are reading and learning from and studying, because just like any other teacher, it has its spots. No matter how ideal, no matter how perfect it may be, it's copied by humans. It's being heard by humans. And it bears all of those human limitations. I love it. And I read it a lot. Different versions of it. This is why I have a whole shelf full of these things. Different translations with different footnotes in Greek and in Hebrew and in multiple Englishes, because it is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Like people are beautiful, wonderful things. And just like people are beautiful, wonderful things, it's messy. And it needs to be loved as such. So that is a little bit of a peek behind the veil for what I'm doing and how I'm approaching it when I read through this and try to bring this to all of you on Sundays. I have to consider, where does the text say something other than what I'm reading in this? How else can these words be rendered? Did early Christians read this in it at all, or was this a later addition, probably meant with the best of intentions? I don't know. That's the book we got. And I'm so excited to keep bringing it here and into my life. Amen.